Eleanor Vance closed the case file and leaned back in her leather executive chair. Outside the window of her chambers in the State Superior Court building, the sun was slowly setting, painting the city skyline in golden hues. She rubbed her face, feeling the exhaustion of yet another complex trial. 15 years on the bench, the last 5 as the supervising judge of the civil division. Her name commanded respect in legal circles, and her rulings were frequently cited in law school textbooks. Her cell phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Andy. "Hey, Sunshine, my parents are insisting we meet this Saturday. Can you make it?" Eleanor smiled. She and Andy had been dating for 8 months, and they had been the happiest months she'd had in years. After her divorce, she thought she would never be able to trust anyone again, but Andy was different. A straightforward, genuine guy who worked as a machinist at a local manufacturing plant. He didn't know her real profession. She had simply told him she worked at a law firm. It was a small, almost harmless lie. Or so she told herself. "Of course I'll be there." What time she typed back. But as the meeting with his parents approached, something inside her fluttered a mix of anxiety and foreboding. Andy spoke of his family with warmth, but she noticed how he tensed up whenever his mother was mentioned. "She can be a bit demanding," he had warned carefully. On Saturday morning, Eleanor stood before her mirror, studying her reflection. The tailored designer suits she usually wore to the courthouse hung in her closet. Instead, she chose a simple navy blue wrap dress and a light cardigan. No jewelry save for modest stud earrings and minimal makeup. Andy's parents lived in an older, historic suburb in a 2-story colonial that had clearly seen better days. The paint on the porch railing was peeling, but the yard was immaculately manicured. "Don't worry," Andy whispered as they climbed the porch steps. "They're going to love you." The door swung open before they could even ring the bell. A tall woman in her 60s with cold gray eyes stood on the threshold. Teresa Miller, Andy's mother, looked Eleanor up and down with a calculating gaze. "Well, come on in already," she said in lieu of a greeting. "The pot roast is getting cold." In the formal dining room, Andy's father Peter, a quiet retired engineer, was already seated at the table alongside Andy's sister Irene. Irene, a woman in her early 30s, wore an expensive silk blouse and sported a flawless bright manicure. "So this is the one who finally caught our little Andy," Irene drawled, not bothering to stand. "We thought he was going to be a bachelor forever." Eleanor extended her hand for a handshake, but Irene just waved her off dismissively, pointing to an empty chair. Dinner began in a tense silence. Teresa served the food with the air of a martyr performing a heavy burden. "So, tell us about yourself, Eleanor," Teresa finally said, not lifting her eyes from her plate. "Andy says so little about you. Where do you work? What do you do?" Eleanor felt her shoulders tense. This was the moment. She could tell the truth. She should tell the truth. But something in Teresa's tone, in Irene's cold, evaluating stare, made her hold her tongue. "I'm a janitor," she heard her own voice say, "at a downtown corporate building." A heavy, sticky silence hung over the table. Andy whipped his head around, his eyes wide with shock. He knew she worked at a law firm, but nothing more. "A janitor," Irene repeated, her voice dripping with poorly concealed contempt. "How interesting." "Well, a job is a job," Peter said, trying to keep the peace, but his wife shot him a glare that instantly silenced him. Teresa slowly set her fork down. Her face displayed a spectrum of emotions from surprise to undisguised disappointment. "A janitor," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Andy, sweetheart, you didn't mention your girlfriend was in such a modest line of work." Mom, Andy started, but Teresa held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not judging, of course," she continued, using a tone that meant the exact opposite. "Any honest day's work is worthy of respect. But you have to understand, Andy, our family. We have always strived for a certain standard. Your father is a retired engineer. I spent my whole life in education. Irene is a successful manager at a major tech firm. And what of it?" Eleanor asked, a chill creeping into her own voice. "Does a profession determine a person's worth?" Irene scoffed. "Oh, how philosophical." She turned to her brother. "Andy, are you serious? A cleaning lady. We have them at my office. They don't even make eye contact when you walk past them. They know their place." Eleanor clenched her fists under the taillet. Every word cut like a razor. She had seen this countless times in her courtroom class. Prejudice, arrogance, the absolute certainty of one's own superiority. But it was one thing to observe it from the judge's bench, and quite another to experience it firsthand. "Irene, stop it." Andy tried to intervene, but his sister was unstoppable. "Stop what?" "Telling the truth." She turned to Eleanor with a fake plastic smile. "Forgive me for being blunt, but let's be honest. You must realize Andy could find someone far more suitable. An educated woman with a career with prospects." Irene barked Peter, but his wife instantly talked over him. Peter, stay out of this. Irene is right. Teresa folded her hands on the table. Eleanor, dear, I'm sure you're a lovely person, but you must understand we want the best for our son. He deserves a woman who matches his status. A janitor is simply not on our level. Eleanor felt a white-hot rage boiling inside her. Years of judicial practice had taught her to control her emotions, but right now it took everything she had. She stood up from the table, maintaining an outward calm while a storm raged within. Thank you for dinner, she said, in an even voice. I'll be going. Eleanor, wait. Andy grabbed her hand. Let her go, Irene said coldly. This is for the best. You'll thank us later, Andy. We just opened your eyes. Eleanor walked out of the house, feeling Andy trailing behind her. Out on the sidewalk, she stopped, taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air. Forgive them, he said, trying to pull her into a hug. They don't know what they're saying. I never expected them to act so horribly. It's fine, Eleanor replied, though it was the furthest thing from the truth. Just take me home, please. The drive was silent. Eleanor stared out the window, processing what had happened. She had lied. Had she lied to test them? To protect herself? She didn't even know anymore. But now she had seen the true face of Andy's family. And her gut told her this story wasn't over yet. When he pulled up to her apartment building, Andy tried to apologize again. I'll talk to them, I'll explain. They'll understand. There's no need, Eleanor said. They don't need anything explained to them. They've already made up their minds. She got out of the car and walked into the lobby without looking back. Only when she was safely inside her condo did she allow herself to exhale. She kicked off her heels, poured a glass of Cabernet, and sank onto the sofa. Her phone kept lighting up with texts from Andy. She didn't read them. Instead, she looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights, a city she knew from a completely different angle. From the perspective of courtrooms, laws, and justice. The irony was almost comical. She, a woman who decided people's fates, who ruled on multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuits and bitter family disputes, hadn't been able to handle a standard family dinner. Around midnight, Eleanor finally opened the messages. Elle, please forgive them. They don't realize what they're saying. I'm so ashamed of what happened. Please let's talk. I love you. Their opinion doesn't matter. The last message was sent 10 minutes ago. I'm coming over tomorrow morning. We need to talk. Eleanor set the phone down and closed her eyes. A decision had to be made. She woke up Sunday morning with a clear head and a precise plan. The lie had gone too far. Andy deserved the truth, all of it. And his family? Well, let them find out exactly who they had so contemptuously thrown out the door. At 9 a.m., the doorbell rang. Andy stood there, holding a bouquet of roses, looking utterly miserable. Dark circles framed his eyes. He clearly hadn't slept either. Eli, come in. She stepped aside. We really do need to talk. They sat at the kitchen island. Andy set the flowers down, but didn't dare speak first. I have to tell you something, Eleanor began, intertwining her fingers. And it's not going to be easy to hear. He tensed. I've been lying to you from the very beginning. The color drained from Andy's face. I don't just work at a law firm, and I am certainly not a janitor. She paused. I'm a judge. Supervising judge of the Civil Division at the State Superior Court. Dead silence. Andy stared at her, blinking as if trying to process a foreign language. What? 15 years on the bench? One of the most influential judges in the state, if the legal publications are to be believed? Eleanor's voice was steady, but her stomach was in knots. I lied, because I was so tired of how people change the second they find out what I do. Some start sucking up, others get intimidated, and some try to use me. I wanted you to fall in love with me. Not my title. Andy slumped back in his stool. Jesus, Elle. Why didn't you just tell me earlier? Because I was afraid of exactly this reaction. She offered a bitter smile. See, you're already looking at me differently. I'm looking at you differently because you lied to me for 8 months. Andy's voice rose, but he quickly caught himself. I'm sorry. It's just a shock. I get it. But yesterday, why did you tell my family you were a janitor? Eleanor stood and walked over to the window. An impulse. A stupid, childish impulse. She turned back to him. Your mother and sister looked at me like I was dirt on their shoe from the minute I walked in. I saw the disdain in their eyes and thought, what if I give them a reason to take their arrogance to its logical extreme? What if I see just how petty and worthless people can be when they judge someone solely by their job? So, you decided to test them. Andy ran a hand down his face. God, I didn't plan it. It just slipped out. So what now? Eleanor returned to the island and sat across from him. Now you get to decide. I lied to you, and that's unforgivable. If you want to end this, I'll understand. But I am done lying. To anyone. Not to you, not to your family. Andy stared out the window for a long time, then slowly nodded. I'm angry. I'm really angry. But I love you, Elle. And as crazy as it sounds, I understand why you did it. He looked at her. My mother and Irene were disgusting. I've never seen them act that viciously. It was pure humiliation. They showed their true colors. Yes, and I am ashamed of them. Andy reached across the marble counter and took her hand. But what do we do now? Eleanor squeezed his fingers. I want them to know the truth. Why? For revenge. No. So they realize how terribly wrong you can be when you judge a book by its cover. She held his gaze. Andy, your mother basically called me a servant. Your sister said I wasn't in your class. They threw me out without even trying to know who I really am. That's not just rudeness. It's a toxic classism that poisons society. You want to teach them a lesson? I want them to think about it. Even for just a minute. Andy looked at her for a long time, then slowly nodded. Okay, then let's do it right. On Monday morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse as usual. Her chambers on the 4th floor of the Superior Court building were spacious, overlooking the downtown plaza. Framed diplomas from an Ivy League law school and commendations lined the walls. Case files were neatly stacked on her mahogany desk. Her clerk Maya brought in coffee and the day's docket. Judge Vance, you have a 10 a.m. conference with the appellate panel. At noon, the Graham hearing. After lunch, Maya Eleanor interrupted. I need you to look something up for me. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Last name Miller, Teresa, and Irene. Check if they are involved in any pending litigation in our court or any of the municipal courts in the county. Maya nodded without asking questions. She had worked with Eleanor long enough to know that if the judge was asking, there was a reason. 2 hours later, Maya returned with printouts. Found something interesting. She placed the documents on the desk. Irene Miller filed a civil suit 3 months ago for wrongful termination against a pharmaceutical company. The case is active. And Teresa Miller is the defendant in a property damage suit. She allegedly flooded her downstairs neighbor's condo. The hearing is set for next week in the Municipal District Court. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. So Andy's family wasn't nearly as flawless and untouchable as they tried to project. Irene had lost her job and was fighting to get it back. Teresa was being sued by her neighbors. Ordinary people with ordinary problems who somehow felt entitled to look down on others. Thank you, Maya. That's all I need. When the clerk left, Eleanor stared thoughtfully out the window. A plan was taking shape, but she wasn't sure if she should execute it. It was manipulative. But it was also justice. A lesson. Her phone buzzed. A text from Andy. My mom wants to apologize. Can we meet tomorrow evening? Eleanor smirked. So Teresa had decided to take a step back. She wondered what prompted the change of heart. Did Andy push her? Or did her conscience actually wake up? She typed back fine. But this time, it's on my terms. My place tomorrow at 7 p.m. The reply came instantly, deal. I'll drive them over. Eleanor set her phone down and returned to her files. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting evening. Eleanor spent the next day meticulously preparing. She had no intention of abusing her judicial power for revenge. That went against everything she stood for. But she fully intended to deliver a lesson the Miller family would never forget. Her penthouse condo was impeccably clean. She deliberately placed several professional awards, framed diplomas, and a photograph of herself shaking hands with the state governor at the opening of the new courthouse annex in plain view on the mantel. The built-in bookshelves groaned under the weight of legal encyclopedias and state code commentaries. It would all speak for itself. Andy was nervous. He arrived an hour early, pacing the hardwood floors, constantly adjusting the already perfectly arranged items. Elle, maybe we shouldn't do this, he asked for the 10th time. My mom already knows she was wrong. Why create a scene? Eleanor turned to him, and in her eyes, he saw the exact unyielding authority she projected from the bench. Andy, your mother doesn't realize she was wrong. She realizes she made a mistake in assessing my social status. Those are two fundamentally different things. She wants to apologize. Let's see exactly what she's apologizing for. She took his hand. Listen to me. I don't want to humiliate your family. I want them to understand one simple fact. A person's dignity does not depend on their paycheck or their job title. And if they don't understand that after tonight, then I'm going to have to seriously reconsider our relationship. Andy paled, but he nodded. He knew she was right. The scene at his parents' house had been eating him alive. He couldn't unsee how his mother and sister had treated her. At 7 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the door. Teresa and Irene stood in the hallway. Both were dressed with exaggerated elegance, expensive slacks, perfect blowouts, subtle but clearly high-end makeup. Teresa held a box of artisanal chocolates and a bouquet of flowers. Both wore expressions of polite condescension that were supposed to pass for remorse. "Eleanor, dear," Teresa began, holding out the flowers. "We came to." She stopped mid-sentence as she crossed the threshold. Her gaze swept over the expansive entryway with its rich walnut paneling, lingered on the antique gilded mirror, and darted into the sunken living room with its vaulted ceilings, designer furniture, and the glaringly obvious degrees on the wall. Irene walked in behind her and froze. The healthy blush drained from her face, leaving her looking like wax. "Come in, please." Eleanor took the flowers and led her guests into the living room. Her voice was flawlessly polite, yet glacial. "Have a seat." Teresa sank onto the edge of the plush sofa, as if terrified of dirtying the upholstery. Irene sat beside her, her eyes glued to the bookshelf, boasting volumes of case law. Andy brought out a tray of coffee and pastries, setting it on the glass coffee table before retreating to stand by the window, clearly opting to stay out of the crossfire. So, Eleanor sat in an armchair opposite them, crossing her legs and resting her hands on her lap. "You wanted to say something to me," Teresa swallowed hard. Her eyes darted between the Harvard diploma on the wall and Eleanor's face. "I wanted to apologize for the other night," she started, her voice trembling. "I had no idea that you were such a successful woman." Eleanor didn't move a muscle. Only one eyebrow arched slightly. "Go on." "I realized I jumped to conclusions." Teresa nervously twisted the strap of her designer handbag. "Of course, had I known who you really were, I would never have." "Stop." Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it rang like steel. "Teresa, are you apologizing for failing to recognize a superior court judge? Or are you apologizing for how you treated a human being you believed was a janitor?" Dead silence. Teresa opened her mouth but couldn't force a single word out. "Because those are two fundamentally different things," Eleanor continued. "If your only regret is that you miscalculated my tax bracket, then I have no use for your apology. But I didn't mean to offend you," Teresa stammered. "You didn't mean to offend me, or you didn't mean to offend a judge," Eleanor leaned forward. "Tell me the truth, Teresa. If I actually swept floors for a living, would you be sitting on my sofa right now?" The silence was more eloquent than any confession. Suddenly, Irene jumped up from the couch. "This isn't fair," she blurted out. "You tricked us. You intentionally told us you were a janitor just to test how we'd treat someone you think is beneath you on the social ladder." Eleanor stood up as well, facing her. "Yes, exactly. And you failed that test spectacularly." "You had no right," Irene's face twisted with anger. That's manipulation." "It was a character test," Eleanor replied smoothly. "And you know what, Irene? I'm glad I did it on day one rather than a year or two from now. Because now I know exactly the kind of people I'm dealing with." Andy took a step forward, intending to intervene, but Eleanor stopped him with a sharp gesture. "I have worked in the justice system for many years," she continued, addressing both women now. "I have seen thousands of people, rich and poor, successful and broken, honest people and liars. And do you know what I've learned? A person's true value isn't found in their title or their stock portfolio. It's found in how they treat people who can do absolutely nothing for them." Teresa sat with her head bowed. Her hands were shaking. "You treated me with absolute disgust." Eleanor's voice grew harsher. "Not because I did anything wrong, not because I was rude or uncultured, but solely because you decided I occupied a lower rung in society. You didn't even try to know me as a person." I am so sorry," Teresa whispered, and for the first time, genuine regret cracked her voice. "You're right. I behaved horribly. I always thought that." She trailed off, unable to finish. Eleanor sat back down and poured herself a cup of coffee. Her hands were perfectly steady. "You know, Teresa, what shocked me the most that evening," she said, stirring in some sugar. "It wasn't your snobbery. It wasn't your insults. It was the fact that Andy sat there and said absolutely thinkly." Andy flinched as if he'd been struck. "He sat next to me and listened to his mother and sister humiliate the woman he's been dating for 8 months, and he didn't say a single word in my defense. That is what truly hurt." Andy started, but she held up a hand. "I understand that family ties are strong, but if a man cannot defend his partner from his own family, what kind of partner is he?" Andy went pale. He opened his mouth, but Teresa suddenly stood up. "You are right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You are entirely right. I was abhorrent. I was a snob, an arrogant fool who judges people by their clothes and their resumes. And I truly am sorry, not that I failed to recognize a judge, but that I allowed myself to treat a guest in my home that way. She looked at Eleanor, tears gleaming in her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I don't even know if something like this can be forgiven. But I promise you, I will never let myself act that way again. You taught me a lesson, and I deserved it. Eleanor studied Teresa's face carefully. Years on the bench had trained her to spot a liar. Right now, she saw a woman who had genuinely grasped the magnitude of her mistake. I appreciate your honesty, Eleanor finally said. But you see, Teresa realizing it isn't enough. It requires action. What kind of action? Teresa asked quickly. I'll do anything. Not for me, Eleanor cut her off. I don't need your apologies or your compensation. But the next time you interact with a waitress, a custodian, a cashier, or anyone else, you automatically deem beneath you. I want you to remember today. And I want you to treat them with the basic human dignity everyone deserves. Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her living room long after Andy's family had left. The evening had been draining. She had seen their bewildered faces, heard the belated apologies, and felt the collapse of what could have been her new family. But the wound that bled the most was Andy's silence during that awful Sunday dinner. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea and walked to the window. The city below twinkled entirely indifferent to her internal storm. The next morning, she arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Work always helped her center herself. Her clerk, Maya, brought in coffee and a stack of new case files. Judge, you have a 10 a.m. meeting with Attorney Campbell regarding the Miller case, Maya reminded her. And the chief judge called, asked you to call him back. Eleanor nodded, diving into the documents. The Miller case. She skimmed the file and froze. Irene Miller. V. Pharmatech Solutions. A civil suit for wrongful termination. Fate had an incredibly ironic sense of humor. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, weighing her options. By law, she had to recuse herself personal involvement. Conflict of interest. Technically, they weren't related, and no one besides Eleanor knew of her connection to the plaintiff. She picked up her desk phone and dialed her colleague, Judge Davis. Victor, I have the Miller v. Pharmatech case. Potential conflict of interest on my end. Can you take it on your docket? Sure, Eleanor. Everything okay, just personal circumstances. Thanks, Victor. She hung up, feeling a wave of relief. Whatever her feelings toward Andy's family, she would never let them contaminate the justice system. Justice had to be blind, and a judge impartial. During her lunch break, Andy was waiting for her on the courthouse steps. He looked exhausted, dark bags dragging under his eyes. Elle, please just hear me out, he pleaded as she walked through the revolving doors. Eleanor stopped, crossing her arms. I'm listening. I was a coward. I should have stood up for you when my mom and Irene were attacking you. I never expected them to be that vicious. I thought if I just stayed quiet, it would blow over. Andy, you didn't expect it. Eleanor's voice was weary. We've been together for 8 months. In all that time, you never once warned me about who your mother and sister really are. You didn't give me a heads up, and when they started tearing me down, you just sat there. I know. I get it. No, you don't get it, she interrupted. This isn't about you failing to defend a judge. It's about you failing to defend the person you claim to love. If I really was a janitor, would that have justified their behavior? Would it have made me less deserving of your protection? Andy stared at his shoes, silent. I'm at fault here too, Eleanor continued, softening her tone. I lied to you about my career. I didn't trust you enough to be honest from the start. And you know what the terrifying part is? I was proven right. Your family showed me that in your world, status matters more than humanity. That's not my world, Andy protested. I'm not like them. But you let them be like that. You sat next to me and enabled it. And that is exactly the same thing. A heavy pause settled between them. Lawyers and civilians bustled past them, rushing in and out of the courthouse. But Eleanor and Andy stood trapped in their own bubble of bitterness and disappointment. So, what now? Andy finally asked. Eleanor looked at him for a long, hard moment. I need time to think. We both do. She turned and walked back up the marble stairs, leaving him standing alone on the plaza. That evening, her phone rang. The caller ID read Teresa Miller. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Eleanor. Her prospective mother-in-law's voice was strained. I would like to meet with you privately, if you're willing. Eleanor hesitated, but curiosity won out. Tomorrow at 6. The Four Seasons Coffee Shop on 4th Avenue. I'll see you there. Thank you. The next day, Eleanor walked into the cafe at exactly 6 p.m. Teresa was already at a corner table, nervously shredding a paper napkin. She looked years older than she had at the apartment. Her makeup couldn't hide the deep exhaustion and anxiety etched into her features. "Thank you for coming," Teresa said as Eleanor sat across from her. "I'm listening." Eleanor ordered a black coffee from a passing barista. Teresa took a shaky breath. "My whole life. I believed that status and social standing were the only things that mattered. My father was a blue-collar factory worker. We lived in a cramped apartment, and I saw how the people above us treated us. When I married Peter, when we started climbing the corporate and social ladder, I swore to myself my children would never experience the humiliation I endured." Eleanor listened in silence. "But somewhere along the way, I turned into the exact kind of person I hated when I was young. I started looking down on people, judging them by their zip codes and job titles. And I taught my children to do the same." Teresa's voice cracked, especially Irene. "And the result? You were right. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what you said, the difference between regretting a mistake and feeling true remorse. And I realized I'm not ashamed because you turned out to be a judge. I'm ashamed because I acted like absolute garbage to a woman my son loves." Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. These were not the words she had expected. "I'm not asking you to give us another chance," Teresa continued. "I just need you to know that I am truly sorry, whether you stay with Andy or not. I wanted to apologize to you, human to human." The barista dropped off Eleanor's coffee. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug. "You know, Teresa," she began slowly, "every single day in my courtroom I see people who have made mistakes. Some are genuinely remorseful. Others are just sorry they got caught. Figuring out which is a big part of my job." Teresa looked up at her. "And what do you see right now? I see a woman who is beginning to understand what she broke. That's a start. But understanding is only step one. True remorse is measured in actions, not words." "What can I do?" Teresa asked eagerly. "I'll do it." "Not for me," Eleanor stopped her. "I don't need your apologies or your penance. Change yourself. Not for me, not for Andy, but for you. Stop measuring people by their resumes or their bank accounts. Learn to see the human being behind the social role, and teach your daughter to do the same before it's too late." Teresa nodded, and Eleanor saw real tears spilling over her eyelashes. "What about you and Andy?" Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, organizing her thoughts. "I don't know. I honestly don't know. I love him. But trust is incredibly easy to break and brutally hard to rebuild. He let me down when I needed him to have my back, and I lied to him from day one. Maybe neither of us is ready for a real relationship." "He loves you so much," Teresa said softly. "I've never seen him this miserable." "Sometimes love isn't enough," Eleanor replied. "You need courage, honesty, and the willingness to stand up for each other even when it's uncomfortable." They finished their coffee in silence. As Teresa stood to leave, she offered her hand. "Thank you for hearing me out. And thank you for the lesson you taught all of us." Eleanor shook it. "Take care of Andy. He's a good man. He just needs to learn how to be a strong one." After Teresa left, Eleanor sat by the window for a long time, watching the downtown traffic. Her phone buzzed. A text from Andy. "I started seeing a therapist. I want to figure out why I couldn't stand up for you. I want to be better. Not just so you'll come back, but for myself. But I still hope that someday I can earn your forgiveness." Eleanor read the message twice. Maybe all was not lost. Maybe this painful collision had forced all of them to grow. But forgiveness was a journey, not a quick fix, and they all had a long road to walk. 2 weeks passed. Eleanor sat in her chambers, reviewing a stack of summary judgment motions, but her mind kept drifting to Andy. He called every day, texted her, but she hadn't responded. She needed space to figure out her own heart. Her desk phone buzzed. "Andy." She sighed and let it go to voicemail. At that moment, someone knocked on her door. "Judge Vance, you have a visitor." Maya looked a bit bewildered. "She says it's a personal matter. Who is it?" "Teresa Miller." Eleanor froze. Andy's mother was here. Curiosity overpowered her annoyance. "Send her in." Teresa walked into the chambers, looking entirely different from the woman Eleanor had first met. "Eleanor, I know I have no right to show up at your workplace." Teresa started, remaining standing. "I should have told you this at the coffee shop, but I couldn't find the words and I was terrified of your reaction. Have a seat." Eleanor gestured to the leather chair opposite her desk. "I'm listening." Teresa perched on the edge of the seat, looking as if she were afraid to take up too much space. "I didn't come to beg on Andy's behalf. He doesn't even know I'm here. She gripped the handles of her purse tightly. I came to tell you the truth I've hidden from everyone, even myself. Eleanor waited in silence. When I was young, I was deeply in love with a man. We were engaged. Teresa's voice trembled. But his parents opposed it. They thought I was trash. I was a blue-collar worker's daughter, and they were old money. They humiliated me. They mocked me, called me a gold digger. Eleanor felt a shift in her chest. He never defended me. He never said a single word to them. Teresa looked up, her eyes wide. Just like Andy didn't defend you, I ended up marrying someone else, Andy's father. Peter was a good man, he loved me, but I carried that humiliation for the rest of my life. And do you know what I did? I turned into the exact monsters I despised. Teresa reached into her purse, pulled out a faded Polaroid, and slid it across the mahogany desk. That's me at 20. Look, you can see the insecurity in my eyes. The desperate need to prove I was worth something. In the photo was a young girl in a plain dress, with a simple haircut and a timid smile. Eleanor could barely recognize the haughty, imperious woman she had met a month ago. I started judging people by their status because I had been judged, Teresa said. I stepped on people I deemed lower because I was trying to erase the memory of being stepped on. She wiped a tear from her cheek. And I taught my kids to do it too. Why are you telling me this? Because you have a right to know. Teresa stood up. It's not Andy's fault he couldn't protect you. I raised him that way. I taught him to avoid conflict, to never argue with me, to always roll over and agree. I broke his spine when he was a boy, and now he is trying to put himself back together piece by piece. Eleanor sat perfectly still, absorbing the weight of the confession. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I just want you to know he's fighting. He goes to therapy 3 times a week. He's learning to say no. He's learning to fight for the things that matter to him. Teresa walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. I ruined my own life by letting other people's opinions dictate my worth. Don't let my mistakes ruin yours. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long time. Finally, she picked up her cell phone and dialed. Andy, we need to talk. They met at the same casual diner where Andy had taken her on their first date. He was already there, nervously shredding a paper coaster. When Eleanor walked in, he jumped up so fast he nearly knocked his chair backward. Thanks for agreeing to meet. He looked haggard, shadows pooling beneath his eyes. Your mother came to my chambers, Eleanor said, sliding into the vinyl booth opposite him. Andy went pale. What I didn't know. I didn't ask her to do that. I know, she told me. Eleanor paused. She told me a lot of things. L.I. He stumbled over his words, then found his footing, his voice growing firmer. I'm not going to make excuses. What I did, or rather what I failed to do, is unforgivable. I betrayed you. I let them humiliate you, and I sat there like a coward. Eleanor listened without interrupting. I have spent my entire life terrified of conflict, terrified of making people mad. I thought it was normal to smooth things over to avoid fights, to just agree with everyone. His jaw tightened. But it's not normal. It's cowardice. And I am so sick of being a coward. What changed? Andy looked her dead in the eye. Last week, my mom started making comments about you again. Calling you arrogant, saying you hold grudges. And for the first time in my 30 years on this earth, I told her to shut the hell up. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I told her you had every right to never forgive me, that I don't deserve it, and that she had zero right to judge you after what she did. He clenched his fists on the Formica table. We had a massive fight. I walked out and ignored her calls for 3 days. It might sound stupid to anyone else, but to me, it felt like jumping out of an airplane. And then what happened? Then she came to my place and actually apologized. No excuses. No blaming anyone else. Andy leaned back in the booth. We had our first honest conversation in decades. She told me about her past, why she acts the way she does. I realized we were both hostages to her insecurities. Eleanor analyzed him. A part of her just wanted to walk away to leave all this baggage behind, but another part saw a man who was fighting tooth and nail to be better. Andy, I can't just forgive and forget, she said finally. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I know. But I am asking for one chance to prove I've changed. Just one. She looked at him with utmost seriousness. If you ever let me down again, if you ever sit in silence when you should be standing up for us, we are done. Permanently. Andy nodded the tension, leaving his shoulders as relief washed into his eyes. I won't let you down. I swear to God. Promises are easy to make. Eleanor stood up, grabbing her coat. They're harder to keep. Show me with your actions, not your words. The next few weeks were a stress test for both of them. Andy stayed in therapy and Eleanor watched him transform. He grew more confident, more willing to voice his opinions without fearing disapproval. Irene had changed too. Her wrongful termination suit was heard by Judge Davis, and she lost. The court ruled her firing was justified. But instead of crying injustice, she took a mid-level job at a smaller logistics company, and for the first time in her life, she seemed grounded. You know, losing that case was the best thing that could have happened to me. Irene confessed when she and Eleanor bumped into each other at a downtown mall. I spent my whole life thinking I was elite, and it turns out I'm just an average employee who had an inflated ego. Teresa was doing the work too. She joined a support group and started volunteering at a local soup kitchen. Eleanor found out about it through the grapevine and was genuinely stunned by the pivot. But the ultimate test came on Teresa's birthday. She invited Eleanor and Andy to a dinner party. Eleanor accepted, though her stomach was tied in knots. The house was full of extended family and old friends. One of the guests, a woman named Carol, struck up a conversation with Eleanor. Not knowing the truth, Teresa hadn't broadcasted Eleanor's real job. Carol wrinkled her nose. My goodness, Teresa, Carol drawled loudly. Your son is dating a cleaning lady. How do you tolerate it? Eleanor froze, waiting for the reaction. Teresa straightened her spine and looked Carol dead in the eye, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. First of all, Eleanor is a supervising judge at the state superior court. Secondly, even if she swept floors for a living, it wouldn't make her any less of an incredible woman. A person's worth is not their W-2. She looped her arm through Eleanor's. And third, Carol, if you have a problem with my future daughter-in-law, you know where the front door is. Carol flushed violently and clamped her mouth shut. Andy stepped up to Eleanor's other side and took her hand. They stood there as a united front, and for the first time, Eleanor felt like this was what a real family looked like. Not one defined by bloodlines, but one that chooses to protect its own. Later that night as they drove home, Andy pulled his truck over at a scenic overlook above the city. Elle, I need to say something. He shifted in the driver's seat to face her. I know we're still rebuilding. I know we have a long way to go. But I need you to know that I love you. Not the judge, not the prestige, just you. The woman who forced me to finally be brave. Eleanor looked out at the sprawling grid of city lights. I love you too, she said finally. But love isn't everything. We need respect, trust, and the guts to defend each other. I know, and I'll prove it to you every single day. He turned to her and smiled, a real warm smile, completely devoid of doubt. Then we have a chance, she smiled back. 3 months later, Eleanor had been watching Andy with the cautious scrutiny of a seasoned judge evaluating the sincerity of his rehabilitation. She wasn't one to make hasty rulings. One evening, walking along the waterfront, Andy recounted a conversation with his mother. She started complaining about the new cashier at the grocery store, he said, watching the dark water of the bay. She said something like, "These retail workers are getting so lazy," and I shut her down. I told her I would not tolerate her talking like that around me. Eleanor looked at him intrigued. How did she react? Got defensive at first. Gave me the silent treatment. Andy rubbed the back of his neck. But later she admitted you were right. That she really was hurting people without realizing it. Or maybe she did realize it, but just thought it was her right. Eleanor said nothing. Words were one thing. Actions were evidence. She kept waiting. The real test arrived unexpectedly. As they often do. Eleanor was in her chambers reviewing depositions when Maya buzzed in. Judge Teresa and Irene Miller are in the reception area. They look pretty frantic. Eleanor told Maya to send them in, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Eleanor Teresa began. All traces of her former pride vanished. We came to ask for your help. Not for us. For Andy. Eleanor dropped her pen. What happened? Irene clutched her handbag with white knuckles. There was an accident at the manufacturing plant where he works. Nothing catastrophic, but management is looking for a scapegoat. Andy. Andy took the blame, even though it wasn't his shift. He's covering for a junior machinist who has 3 kids and a sick wife. Now Andy is facing termination and a massive civil liability suit from the company. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She stood and walked to her window looking down at the courthouse plaza. Regular people with regular problems. Fighting battles that felt like the end of the world. Why did you come to me? She asked without turning around. Why didn't Andy ask me himself? He knows we're here, Teresa said quickly. He forbade us from coming. He said he refuses to let you think he changed just to use your influence. He said he won't drag you into this. Eleanor slowly turned to face them. Tell me everything from the beginning. And don't leave out a single detail. The story matched their summary perfectly. Eleanor made a few discreet phone calls and verified the facts. Andy really had fallen on his sword for someone else. Mike, the junior machinist, was drowning in medical debt. Losing his union job would have destroyed his family. Andy knew it, and he made his choice. Eleanor closed her eyes. This wasn't her courtroom. It wasn't her jurisdiction. But she knew the players knew the right regulatory agencies knew how to flag a file for an OSHA inspection. She could help entirely, legally, simply by pointing a spotlight in the right direction. The question was, should she go home? She told Teresa and Irene. I need to think. Alone in her chambers, she remembered the night she had claimed to be a janitor, the disgust in those women's eyes, Andy's paralyzing silence. But she also weighed the last 6 months, the tiny daily choices he had made to be a better man, the grueling therapy, and now this. He had risked his livelihood to shield someone weaker than him. Eleanor picked up her desk phone. A week later, the company dropped its pursuit of Andy. After Eleanor made a few calls, state inspectors descended on the plant. The true cause of the accident was traced to grossly outdated machinery that corporate had refused to replace to save money. The heat immediately shifted from the floor workers to upper management. Andy found out about her involvement by accident. One of the union reps mentioned Judge Vance's name in passing. He showed up at her condo late that night. Standing in the doorway, his eyes were a storm of gratitude, guilt, and something deeper. Why? He asked. After everything I put you through. Why did you help me? Eleanor pulled him inside. They sat on her living room sofa, the space between them thick with unsaid words. Because you made the right choice, she finally answered. You stood up for someone who needed defending. You risked yourself for someone else. That is exactly what I needed to see. Andy dropped his head into his hands. I'm no hero, Elle. I just couldn't do nothing. When I looked at Mike, saw how terrified he was for his family, I remembered that dinner. I remembered sitting there while my mom tore you apart. And I realized I would rather die than ever be that guy who looks the other way again. Eleanor felt a hard knot in her chest dissolve. She reached out and rested her hand over his. Your mother and sister came to my chambers, she said softly. They begged me to help you. Did you know? He shook his head. I told them absolutely not. I told them I would never leverage your position. If we're going to be together, I want it to be because you want me, not because you owe me or pity me. And what do you want? Andy, Eleanor asked, searching his eyes. What do you really want? He was silent for a moment, then gently intertwined his fingers with hers. I want to be with you. I want to be the kind of man you respect. The kind of man you're proud of. I know I failed you back then. I know trust doesn't just reappear. But I will spend the rest of my life earning it back if you let me. Eleanor looked at him, her judicial mind racing. She saw a man who had committed a severe error, admitted his guilt, and put in the agonizing work to rehabilitate himself. She saw real, painful, permanent change. I have one condition, she said. Anything. Andy exhaled. Name it. No more lies. Ever. No matter how ugly the truth is, absolute honesty. I will not build a life on deception, even if it's born of good intentions. Andy nodded, immense relief flooding his features. I swear it. Nothing but the truth. Eleanor took a deep breath. She still harbored a fraction of doubt. But life rarely offered ironclad guarantees. People could change if they were pushed hard enough, and sometimes you had to take a leap of faith to find something real. Then let's start over, she said, slowly, step by step. Andy smiled, a wide boyish grin breaking through his exhaustion. Step by step, 1 year later. Eleanor stood by the window of her chambers, watching a gray October sky blanket the city. So much had changed. Not because life was suddenly a fairy tale, but because it was finally honest. She twisted the simple, elegant platinum wedding band on her left hand. They had picked it out together and married just 2 weeks ago in a tiny, private ceremony. Teresa had wept through the vows, and Eleanor knew they were tears of genuine redemption. Irene had been a bit stiff, but she had shown up and offered a warm, if slightly awkward toast. Her phone buzzed. A text from her husband. Forgot to tell you this morning. I love you. Making dinner tonight. Eleanor smiled and began typing a reply when there was a knock at the door. Judge Vance, your 2 p.m. calendar is ready, Maya said, popping her head in. The Crawford divorce settlement. Thank you, Maya. I'll be right out. Maya closed the door. Eleanor stood still for a moment, staring at the text. I love you. A year ago, those words felt cheap. Now they were backed by a mountain of evidence. She set her phone down, grabbed the Crawford file, and walked into the courtroom. The hearing began routinely. A bitter couple fighting over assets, the suburban house, the SUV, the joint checking account, standard docket material. Until the husband spoke up. Your Honor, the man said, looking exhausted, I don't want the house. She can have it. His soon-to-be ex-wife snapped her head toward him. Are you out of your mind? No. He shook his head. We have kids. They need the stability more than I need the equity. Eleanor paused, her pen hovering over her ledger. It was rare to see it in a courtroom the exact moment a human being chooses the harder, nobler path over personal gain. She signed the decree, adjourned the court, and realized as she stepped off the bench he had made a choice. Just like Andy had. And for the first time in a long time, she felt zero doubt about her own life. She got home earlier than expected. The condo smelled like roasting garlic and herbs. Andy was at the stove in a faded t-shirt, looking intensely focused and slightly ridiculous as he chopped vegetables. You're home early, he said, turning around. I'm not done yet. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway, just watching him. Watching this life they had fought so hard to build. Everything okay? He asked, catching her intense gaze. Yeah, she said softly. Everything is fine. But that wasn't entirely true, because a final thought was crystallizing in her mind. Andy, she said as they sat down to eat. I need to tell you something. He immediately tensed. It was a knee-jerk reaction, and Eleanor noted it. Don't panic, she smiled faintly. It's not what you think. He exhaled, but his guard remained up. What's going on, Eleanor? Set her fork down. Tomorrow I have a highly unusual case on my docket. How so? Your mother is a party to it. A lie. Pure cold and calculated. She watched him like a hawk. It was her final test. Andy froze. What do you mean she's a party to it? Her condo HOA is suing her over structural damages. The case was randomly assigned to my civil division. Technically, I am within my rights to preside over it. Silence. The deafening, heavy silence where futures are decided. Andy looked away, running a hand through his hair. Can you? He stumbled over the words. Can you? Help her out. There it was, the crossroads. Eleanor said nothing. She just waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Suddenly, Andy straightened his posture, as if a steel rod had been inserted into his spine. No, he said firmly. Eleanor narrowed her eyes slightly. What no? Don't do a damn thing. He looked her dead in the eyes. If she owes the money, she pays it. If she doesn't, the court will figure it out. He paused, taking a deep breath. I never ever want you to compromise your ethics or break your principles for me or for my family. He spoke calmly without theatrics, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. Andy, Eleanor said quietly, You realize this could bankrupt her. I realize that he interrupted, but it's her life and her responsibility. He leaned across the table. If we are doing this, we are doing it with total honesty. No exceptions, no favors. Silence filled the room, and then Eleanor smiled. A real deep, radiant smile. Good, she said. Andy frowned. What do you mean, good nothing? She stood up to clear her plate. Just, thank you. He watched her thoroughly confused, but she already knew. He had passed. The verdict was final. There was no HOA lawsuit the next day. But that evening, Eleanor called Teresa. Come over to our place tomorrow at 7. Bring Irene. Is everything all right? Teresa asked, instantly worried. Yes, Eleanor said calmly. Everything is perfectly fine. When they arrived, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't the hostile tension of their first visit. It was the quiet anticipation of a monumental conversation. Have a seat, Eleanor said. They sat. Andy stood nearby, still completely in the dark. Eleanor looked at the three of them. I have a confession to make. She let the words hang in the air. Yesterday I lied to Andy. Teresa stiffened. Irene frowned. There is no lawsuit against you, Teresa. It doesn't exist. It was a test. Andy whipped his head toward her. A test, yes, Eleanor said evenly. The last one. She looked at her husband. I needed to know if you had actually changed or if you were just playing the part when things were easy. Silence. And you said no? She continued, her voice softening. You explicitly told me not to bend the law for your mother. That is all I ever needed to know. Andy stared at her, then slowly sank onto a bar stool. So, it was a pop quiz. No, Eleanor shook her head. It was reality. Irene let out a nervous laugh. Is everything in your life a trial, Eleanor? No, Eleanor replied calmly. Trials are easy. You have the law to tell you what to do. Out here, you just have choices. She looked at Andy. And he made the right one. She walked over to her husband and rested her hand gently on his shoulder. No more tests, no more games, just us. He looked up at her, and for the first time his eyes held no fear of making a mistake, Only unwavering certainty. Another year passed. Eleanor stood in the exact same spot by the window in her chambers, but her world was entirely different. Not because it was flawless, but because it was built on bedrock. Her phone buzzed. A text from Andy working, a double shift tonight. I promise no trying to be a hero. She smiled, typing back. I'll leave a plate in the fridge. After a second's hesitation, she added, I'm proud of you. Sometimes justice isn't about handing down a sentence or winning $1 million verdict. Sometimes justice is the quiet moment when a person who spent their whole life rolling over finally stands tall and says, no, not out of fear, but out of absolute conviction. Eleanor Vance Miller closed the case file on her desk and turned off the lights in her chambers. The workday was over, but her life was just beginning.